Today to have speaking our honorary chairman for this year's event, Dr. Charles Asher-Small, who is a graduate of Vanier's social science program, who later received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from McGill, an MSc in Urban Development, Planning and Economics, Development Planning Unit at the University College of London, and a Doctorate of Philosophy at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University. He's founding director and the president of the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, and he convened groundbreaking academic seminar series in the emerging field of contemporary anti-Semitism studies at Columbia University, Harvard University, McGill University, and many, many others, around the world. So I would like to welcome Dr. Charles Small. Just a quick note also, following this, there was a commemoration service in the boardroom, F216. So if anybody's interested, all is welcome, and we'd love to see more students there. So please feel free to come along. Thanks, bye.
Thank you, Marlene. And it's an amazing thing that Marlene Grossman is doing. I think this is one of the most important, preeminent symposiums and conferences on the Holocaust and issues of genocide. So it's very an important event, and I think Vandy is really at in a sense, the cutting edge of dealing with these issues. So Marlene, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor that myself and the organization that I direct, called the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, is co-chairing this event. So it's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to speak to you. So today I'm going to speak about issues of anti-Semitism. And have people heard about anti-Semitism? Do you know what it is? Yes. Okay, good. Anybody not sure what it is? Okay, thank you. A few honest people. The best thing about education and learning, and I still do this to this day, even though I'm coming here as an expert, the key to learning, or a key to learning, is never be embarrassed to say I don't know. Because once you say I don't know or I don't understand, then you're 90% there to learning and getting to understand. So always feel free. I think it's a sign of wisdom to say, I don't know, or I haven't heard of this. So always ask. So basically, anti-Semitism is a specific form of hatred. Some scholars call it the longest hatred, and I can explain why. But it's a type of hatred that emerged in Europe against Jewish people. And the term was actually coined in the 1870s by a man called Wilhelm Marr. He was a German philosopher and thinker. He was sort of the father, a generation or two generations before the rise of Nazism and Hitler. He was sort of a generation or two before Hitler, and he's sort of seen as the father of Nazism. And he coined the phrase anti-Semitism as a form of hatred specifically against Jewish people, and he said it proudly. So this was a sort of a movement, a term that he hoped people would sort of ascribe to and follow. So Wilhelm Marr labeled or named the concept of anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism, or the hatred of Jewish people, goes back much further. So I'm going to speak about anti-Semitism, and it's fitting. Today is Yom HaShoah. Today is the day of Holocaust Memorial. Today, people from around the world mark this occasion to commemorate the Holocaust, the killing, the murdering of more than 6 million Jewish people in Nazi-occupied Europe during the Second World War. We call this the Holocaust. So there's a commemoration which would be wonderful if you would come to and participate in. So today it's a special day to commemorate this type of brutality. The thing is about anti-Semitism is, why should a Jewish scholar come to such a diverse group of Canadian, Quebecois young students and talk about anti-Semitism, a form of hatred against Jewish people? Because I think we live in a society where we're all kind of fragmented these days, especially, I think more and more. And what does it matter? Why should you care about a Jewish problem? Why should you care about a problem of the demonization of the state of Israel? Maybe some of you don't like the state of Israel. Some of you don't have problems with Jews, but you don't like the state of Israel. And the state of Israel is commemorating the Holocaust, and the Jewish people today are commemorating the Holocaust, and it's kind of a Jewish problem. It's a Jewish thing. So why should there be national museums and days against or commemorating the Holocaust? And I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, in the words of Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor. He became a great intellectual. He was a journalist, a philosopher. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature. He wrote a famous book called Night by Elie Wiesel. It's a book that will take you a maximum 90 minutes to read it. It's a thin book. It's a thin book about how he and his father sort of traveled through the Holocaust. And it's an amazing book. If you read the book, it will change your appreciation of life. So I recommend it strongly. And Elie Wiesel famously said that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And I think if there's a few phrases that I can say to you today, please remember this phrase, that anti-Semitism begins with the Jewish people, their target number one, but it never, ever, ever stops with the Jews. Once this type of hatred, which is inherently, and I'll explain it why, is inherently genocidal, once this genocidal hatred is unleashed upon society, it knows no bounds. They start with the Jews, and then they will go to the gay people, and then they'll go to women, and then they'll go to the moderates in society, and then they'll go to the minorities in society, and then they'll go to the people who belong to the dominant group, but they have different political or religious views, so they become the enemy that has to be cleansed from this attempt to purify and get rid of contamination within the society, but to purify the nation, to purify the group. And time again, history teaches us that it begins with the Jews, but never, ever does it stop with the Jews. And this is why any of us here today who believe in democratic principles, that believe in the freedom of practicing religion, believe in notions of privacy, that you can do what you want in your home, in your temple, to become part of a multicultural, vibrant society where in principle we have strong notions of citizenship, and we have the notion of being equal under the law, regardless of our religion, our race, our ethnicity, our language, and our social and economic status. These democratic notions, every generation has to stand up and maintain and expand. Right? I was telling a friend the other day, I'm Jewish. I'm Jewish because my mother's Jewish. That's why I became Jewish. In the Jewish religion, if your mother's Jewish, the children are Jewish. So I inherited, I was given my identity at birth. But as citizens of democratic societies, every generation has to ensure that those basic principles of citizenship and equality under the law are maintained and expanded. Expanded. 70, 60, 50 years ago, my father could not go to McGill University because Jews weren't allowed. Then there were quotas on Jews, so only a few Jews were able to go. And we can see 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, people of African origin, of African descent, who were in this country for hundreds of years, were banned or not able to enter the universities of this city and of this country. Things have changed. Women were subjugated. There's more women in schools today. So every generation, thankfully for several generations now, have been pushing the boundaries of democratic principles and strengthening the notion of citizenship in Canada and in other countries around the world, but Canada is among the select few. So it's incumbent upon my generation, and now as you enter into the workplace, into society, as you're being educated, hopefully your generation will pick up the baton and expand the notions of democratic forces in our country. So anti-Semitism is a threat not just to the Jewish people, and not just to Israel. It's a threat to the very foundation of democratic notions that we all aspire here in this room, whether you're liberal, whether you're more conservative, whether you're secular, whether you're religious. As citizens of this country, we all are trying to expand democratic ideals and democratic practice. So I'm going to speak about the history of anti-Semitism briefly and how today, in the words of Elie Wiesel, he said, today we are living in a state of emergency. That never in his life since the end of the Holocaust in 1945 was he, so he passed away a year ago, but in recent years, he was never so terrified and worried about the future of humanity as he was as the end of the Holocaust came. So from 1945 until the last few years, he has been more concerned now than ever in his life. And we are living today, ladies and gentlemen, in a very precarious moment. A moment when we commemorate the Holocaust. The phrase of the Holocaust in memory was never again, but we know Cambodia happened. We know Rwanda happened. We know Darfur continues to happen. And tragically, ladies and gentlemen, in Syria today, it's nothing less than an ongoing, in real time, we can Google it, in real time, everybody knows. For the last 700 years, between 625,000 to 700,000 people have been murdered by reactionary, repugnant, anti-democratic forces that have a culture of death. 15 million people displaced. The region is imploding. Refugees are flooding into neighboring countries, into Turkey, into Europe, causing all sorts of reactions. And it's this moment that students and people need to become aware of these things that are right in front of us. We sort of know about it, but nothing is being done. And on a day like today, we really need to take stock of these type of issues. So how does anti-Semitism tie into a genocide in Syria? And this is what this will be the topic of the focus of my conversation, and then I'm going to try to leave time. I will leave time for comments and questions and such. We can have a conversation. So anti-Semitism has three major phases. The first phase is a religious phase. The second phase is a fascist, racist phase. And the third phase is an attack on who Jews are as a people. And they're all very distinct, but one thing that interconnects them, one constant, is the inherent, and my words I'm choosing very carefully as a scholar, the inherent genocidal makeup of this form of hatred. And I would submit to you it's different than other forms of hatred. Other forms of racism, sexism are repugnant, are immoral, are unethical, but there's a rationale to it. You can create a system where white people, whatever that means, create an identity of whiteness and an identity of blackness, and the whiteness is pure, and the whiteness is elite, and the whiteness is more advanced, and the whites have to be on the top of society, and the darker people are, the lower they are. And then people like Hegel and Descartes, the founders of Western philosophy and theory, then argue in this wonderful scheme of ideas that it's incumbent upon the white person to uplift the African through slavery. And through slavery, they can interact with the European white people so they become more enlightened. Now, repugnant, unethical, scientifically unsound. We can, go on and on and on and look at this period of colonialism and say, how repugnant. But there was a rationale. There was a rationale of power. If you're a small group in South Africa and you can rationalize subjugating, segregating, and getting people to work for you as slaves, immoral, but economically it's kind of a good thing. You develop and maintain power. There's a rationale to it. It's rational forms of hatred. When it comes to anti-Semitism, it's something different. And I'm not going to say better or worse, but it's a different phenomenon. It's inherently genocidal. So there isn't even this notion of we're going to enslave the people to make wealth for us, No, we have to get rid of them. So when the dominant perspective of reality was seen through the lens of religion, and I'm namely looking at religion in Europe, Christianity, Catholic Church, they taught, rather consistently with some exceptions here and there over the centuries, that Jews were blinded by evil. And they were blinded by evil because they could not accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. So redemption was impossible for the Jew. And not only was the Jew unable, the individual Jew unable to have redemption because of their unwillingness or their blindness to evil, but because the Jews weren't accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah, world redemption would become impossible. So the whole redemption of the world was bound up on converting or changing or killing, getting rid of the Jew. And this is where Elias and other scholars write about the inherent genocidal aspect of the civilizing process. So the Jews, inherent in this type of anti-Semitism, was a genocidal tendency. When the view, the dominant worldview, shifted from religion, namely in Europe and other parts of the world as well, and shifted to modernity, to biologically determined notions of identity, to notions of race, ethnicity, and when this was the dominant way of seeing the world, shifting from religion to science and biology, and to race and to nation, people, scientists like Herder and Hegel and Heidegger, all the founding fathers of these types of thinking, believed that we were all different racial groups. And unlike during the Christian phase of anti-Semitism, if you were born Jewish or you were born white or you were born black, right, you had inherent characteristics. So a Jew can go to the finest Western universities, they can learn opera, they can go and learn the social science, become a doctor of medicine, become a scientist, but they still have this inherent traits that were biological. You couldn't cultivate them, change them through cultural practices, through education. They were inherent. And the white supremacists, or the white nation, the Aryan nation, right, believed that the Jews were contaminants, a disease, responsible for all the problems in the world, economic, social, health, you name it. The Jews were responsible. And the only way to purify and to save the nation, again, was bound up in the Jew. To save the nation, you had to eliminate the Jew. And in this form of anti-Semitism, there was no way to convert them to Christianity. There's no way to convert them out of their racial identity as the Jew, as a Semite. So they had to be removed. And this type of anti-Semitism culminates in the Holocaust, which we're commemorating today, in which it was justified through this book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Has anybody heard of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? One, two, few people have heard. It's a very important text, and I urge you to read it because, tragically, it's one of the most popular texts, again, in the entire world. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is one of the most popular texts in the entire world today. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a text that emerged in France or Russia during the 1970s and the 1980s. It was a forgery. It was the reported minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish people, unnamed Jewish people, that had conspired and were controlling the world. So it's interesting. Some of the stereotypes that Jews have is that they're sort of omnipowerful. They can control society and kind of pull the strings of society. These type of anti-Semitic, racist, genocidal tropes, and they're genocidal tropes that are also around town these days too in Canada and in Quebec. I'm sure some of you have heard of them. That these type of tropes come from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this forged document that emerges in France and Russia in the late 1800s. This text was the foundation of the Holocaust. This text enabled, justified Europeans taking Jews and removing them from society, putting them into ghettos, and then from the ghettos into the final solution to the concentration camps, to gas chambers, to mass extermination, in various ways, from bullets to gas. And it's this lie, this Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that forms a very important type of anti-Semitism that is virulent and strong today in various parts of the world that I'll speak to. Elie Wiesel reminds us that the crematoriums and the Holocaust didn't begin with the railroad tracks and the crematoriums and the gas chambers. The Holocaust began with words and ideas. Words and ideas of hatred. And every form of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of anti-Semitism, anything that dehumanizes any person, begins with ideas and words. And from ideas and words, we go into policies and actions. So our words and our ideas are of paramount importance. In Jewish mysticism, we learn that every word we say, we create angels. If we speak well, if we speak morally and ethically, we unleash angels of goodness, of justice. If we speak poorly, if we gossip behind people's backs, if we denigrate individuals, if we denigrate groups of people, we create angels that are deformed. And these deformed angels go out into the space of the universe and they create havoc. And we have to remember that we're all created in the image of God. That means we all have truth in us. And I remember we do a program at Oxford University where we train professors. And in the teachings of Judaism and in other teachings of other religions, we believe that we're all created in the image of God. So that means the only way for me to become wise, the only way I can become wise from the teachings of Judaism, is to be open to other people. So let's say, hypothetically, I'm racist. I don't like people of African descent. What does that do? It eliminates 1.4 billion possibilities for me to become wise. If I'm sexist, I eliminate 50-odd% of the world's population from enlightening me. You cheat yourself when you objectify groups of people. Because we're all created in the image of God, we all have truths, we have to be open to the truth. And if we're closing ourselves off to other people's truths, we cheat ourselves. A famous philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, his family was exterminated in Lithuania. He survived because he was doing his PhD in France. And he brought Jewish ethics in the 1950s and 60s for the first time into the university system because they didn't allow ideas from others in philosophy. He became one of the most important 20th century philosophers, Emmanuel Levinas. And Emmanuel Levinas taught us, in keeping with what I just said, that the moment we see our face in the other, the moment we see our face in the face of the other, that's the instant we become human. Think about it. The moment we see our face in the face of the other, that's the second, the flash of a second, we become human. And being human is when we recognize the other as created in the image of God, as being of a divine origin like us. And the moment we subjugate, denigrate, objectify, it replaces, in the words of Martin Buber, the I-thou relationship with an I-it relationship. Instead of focusing on getting connected to something higher and bringing ourselves up and expanding our brains and our souls, we objectify people. We're stuck in this material rut of hatred. So we end up just harming ourselves and harming society. So I've now talked about two forms of anti-Semitism, the racist form of anti-Semitism and the old Christian European form of anti-Semitism. Today, those type of anti-Semitisms, I would argue, are essentially a thing of the past, particularly in liberal institutions like colleges and CEGEPs and universities and the media of record. If people would espouse those old Christian Catholic types of genocidal anti-Semitism or the fascist, Nazi, racist forms of anti-Semitism, I think in most places people would be ostracized. Careers would be damaged, if not ended. I don't think we tolerate that type of hatred anymore, at least in liberal institutions. What's happening in Charlottesville, etc., in other parts of the world is another story. But in these institutions, I don't think that would be tolerated. But today, to demonize Jews who they are as a people, I would argue is not only acceptable, but it's encouraged. I believe, and I would argue, that it's not only on the fringes of some extreme professors or extreme politicians, but it has now entered into the mainstream discourse of scholarship at the finest universities in North America and Europe, in this sort of postmodern liberal moment. Namely, that Israel is a Zionist, racist, fascist, Nazi, apartheid, colonial, pinkwashing entity. So if it's true, and we learn this in universities, we learn this in colleges, we learn this at the New York Times, if Israel is an apartheid, racist, fascist, pinkwashing colonial entity, then from a liberal human rights perspective, what are we speaking about? We are speaking about the moral obligation to dismantle the state of Israel, to eradicate it, from a liberal perspective. And that's what is at stake when people demonize Israel. On the other hand, we have the rise of political Islam. When I speak about political Islam, I'm not speaking about Muslims, who are increasingly discriminated against in the West, in North America and Europe, and what's happening in the Middle East to that region is a catastrophe. I'm not speaking about Muslims, and I'm not speaking about Islam. I'm speaking about political Islam. Now, political Islam begins roughly 100 years ago with the Muslim Brotherhood. It can be traced to some other scholars from Afghanistan who influenced some Egyptian thinkers, but we'll start 100 years ago with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood begins as a reaction to British colonialism about 100 years ago. People like al-Banai and Qutb, if anybody read al-Banai and Qutb's writings, here, please read them, because this is the founding intellectuals of a reactionary social movement that has become of extreme importance to the global affairs. Read them and understand them. They helped to create the Muslim Brotherhood, which has a comprehensive view of fusing a very narrow form of Islam with politics. And they want to recreate a caliphate. They want to purify the Islamic world, get rid of colonialists, get rid of foreigners, and put everybody into different categories. Muslims on the top, minorities, some have no place in society. Jews and Christians could become sort of protected minorities called dhimmis. They pay a special tax. They're second class. They're not citizens. They're protected. And they can live within the Islamic Caliphate. The Muslim Brotherhood ends up working with no less than the Nazis, taking European anti-Semitism to the Islamic world, to the Middle East for the first time in history. There was discrimination against Jewish people in the Islamic world and problems like in every other society, but this genocidal form of hatred only enters into the Middle East, into the Islamic world 100 years ago, with the help of the Nazis. And political Islam is trying to get rid of any Muslims who work with, who are connected to the Western world, the Jewish communities, the Christian communities, the Yazidis, the Baha'is, and moderate, secularized Muslims are all the enemy. So this society, this sort of social movement today, political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, the Wahhabis, even the Iranian revolutionary regime that's Shiite, pays homage to the Sunni intellectuals of the Muslim Brotherhood as starting this sort of Islamic revolution. So this is not Islam. Very important not to characterize billions of people into this one movement. But this movement is a reactionary social movement inspired by Nazism, They have taken the most pernicious forms of hatred from Europe and used it, very much like the Nazis have been using it, to further their objectives. So, we learn here, Israel's an apartheid state. It's a colonial state. And as a footnote, I was the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada and the United Kingdom. People know what the ANC is? You know Nelson Mandela? So this was the main opposition to apartheid South Africa. And I worked with Mandela and the leadership of the ANC in the 1980s and 90s, fighting the remnants of Nazism and white supremacy in southern Africa. Same ideology as the Nazis that controlled Africa, southern Africa. So this was the type. So what the Nazis did and what the Muslim Brotherhood is doing and what sort of postmodern hypocritical liberals are doing is focusing on Israel, demonizing Israel, while we have genocide and we have mass exterminations of Syrians, of Iraqis, and societies imploding, which people ignore. And just like when the Nazis came to power, exactly like, the Nazis were saying, look at the Jews, they stick together, but they're controlling society. They're stingy, they cheat, the men defile our women. All sorts of anti-Semitic tropes focusing on the Jew. Focusing on the Jew, focusing on the Jew society. Professor Babel calls this the socialism of fools. So people focused on the Jew, and over here the Nazis came like the puppeteer. You look here, but the Nazis came, took over institutions, took over society, and ultimately there was a Holocaust. More than 6 million Jews were exterminated. The sideshow was anti-Semitism, but we know that more than 80 million Europeans were killed in the Second World War. The entire infrastructure of much of Europe was decimated. But the focus was on the Jew, and Europe was decimated. Today, ladies and gentlemen, the focus is on Jewish people. The Jews have no right to be in Israel. They have no right for self-determination. Israel is an apartheid state, the only democracy in the region, but we'll set that aside for a moment. It's a colonial state, a racist state. And this is what we've started to learn in our universities for reasons which engage also in power. The Islamists, the political Islamists funding your education. People like Tariq Ramadan, who now sits in a prison in Paris, accused of but not found guilty of violent rapes against women. Edward Said, other scholars demonizing Israel, not paying attention to the cleavages that are taking place, that have taken place in Middle Eastern societies for centuries. The focus is on Israel and the Jew, and over here we have a catastrophe. We have the West, the Obama administration aiding and abetting the Muslim Brotherhood. Go read or listen to on YouTube President Obama's speech from 2009 when he invites the Muslim Brotherhood as honored guests of his first major speech, his foreign affairs speech, praising and aiding and abetting, helping them to get elected. The State Department funded it. A social movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, that takes European Nazism, not discrimination, Nazi ideology, calls Jews subhumans, descendants of apes and pigs. According to the ideology, I emulate from the urine, pardon my language, of donkeys. That the Jewish people are evil. Not just Israel, but all the Jewish people. So Nazi propaganda, front row, honored guests in Obama's first speech. The Iranian revolutionary regime, out not only to destroy Israel, but to kill all the Jews of the world. Also aided and abetted in this nuclear weapons agreement, empowered, brought into the family of nations, funds, airplanes of money going to Iran. This is a regime that not only calls for the extermination of Israel, but all Jews, the subjugation of women, the killing of gay people, the Baha'i people, one of the most persecuted people in Iran, the Yazdis, the Kurds, the list goes on and on, of enemies of these reactionary social movements. And these reactionary social movements are not only opposed to the Jews and to the minorities, but they're diametrically opposed to democratic principles. The very notion that all of us in this room from such a diverse background, and yet all here in Montreal, the notion that we would want to be equal under one legal system is repugnant to them. It's a colonial Western hangover that needs to be replaced by the caliphate. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is not a problem of borders. You know, there's a fight between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Some say the border should be at a line started in 1947. Others say at a line in 1948. Others say in 1967. There's a big debate about boundaries. But according to political Islam, even if all of Israel was given to its neighbors, ceded to its neighbors, and the Jewish people said, okay, only in Tel Aviv, we want to have a nation state where everybody will be equal. Christians, Muslims, gay people, minorities, and Jews will be all equal under the law in the democratic city of Tel Aviv. That will not be acceptable, ladies and gentlemen, because in that space, for a Jew, a gay person, a woman, a religious minority, a Christian, a Baha'i, to be equal to a Muslim from that political Islamic perspective, from the Muslim Brotherhood's perspective, would be unethical. That entity would have to be eradicated as well and replaced with the Muslim Brotherhood's version of a caliphate. Again, this is not Islam, but this is a form of a reactionary political movement that uses Islam and Nazism to try and gain control. So that's happening in the Middle East. But now, with the genocide and the catastrophe of Iraq and Syria, we have refugees going to Turkey. Turkey and Erdogan, a friend of the West, is now becoming very much in keeping with the Muslim Brotherhood. We have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of 100,000 students have been arrested and disappeared. Professors arrested and disappeared. 30,000 professors missing. As Erdogan takes over power in the model of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Turkey, the one country that was democratic and sort of leaning to the West or open to the West, is now shifting, and shifting dramatically. And then, in the West, our education system does not look at the differences between political Islam and other forms of Islam. Muslims are become characterized as terrorists. So the anti-Muslim, the anti-immigrant, the anti-sort of xenophobic politics, the rise of nationalism in Europe begins, and the rise of nationalism begins with our neighbor to the south. Imagine the KKK and the Aryan nations in 2018-17 walking without sheets. These people were proud. There was no social cost for them. They're not going to lose their jobs. Their families won't stop speaking to them. They were proud marching with those Nazi slogans, barefaced with no sheets. What has happened? And I submit to you that if we tolerate the anti-Semitism of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Iranian Revolutionary Regime and Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, and it's okay to demonize the Jews, and it's okay to demonize Israel, not only do we have a catastrophe in Syria and Iraq where hundreds of thousands of people continue as we speak to be murdered now by chemicals, by chemical weapons on their own citizens, but that we should not be surprised in the West that if we accept the protocols and the elders of Zion and genocidal anti-Semitism in Iran and in Gaza and in Cairo, why won't it come to Charlottesville? Why won't it come to St. Louis, Missouri? Why won't it come to the streets of London? Why won't it come to the streets of Paris? In this age of the internet, when information and ideas are flashing at fractions of seconds around the world. And here, I'm going to show you a man who started Islamic studies at Oxford University. Oxford University. Sheikh Kawadawi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, the leading intellectual, spiritual leader of a very serious movement, a movement that funds the best universities in the world, where textbooks are written. Okay. Here is what he has to say, and this is not that he woke up in the morning in a bad mood. What he says here is the core of its ideology, not the military wing, not the extreme wing, but the core ideology. Listen to what he has to say. And imagine, this is the first founder of Islamic studies at Oxford University, and this type of ideology is seeping into universities around the United States, Canada, and Europe.
الله سلط عليهم طوال التاريخ من يؤدبهم نتيجة إفسادهم. آخر تأديب كان تأديب هتلر، ما فعل بهم وإن كانوا بالغوا في الأمر ما بلغوا، ولكن استطاع أن يوقفهم عند حدودهم، وكان هذا أدبا إلهيا، تأديبا إلهيا، عقابا قدريا لهؤلاء. والمرة القادمة إن شاء الله ستكون على أيدي المؤمنين. كل ما أتمناه في ختام كلمتي هذا أن يهيئ الله لي في ختام حياتي فرصة للذهاب إلى أرض الجهاد والمقاومة على كرسي متحرك، فأطلق رصاصة على أعداء الله اليهود.
Okay, so, Marlene, how much time do I have?
If you want questions, we have about 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to just wrap up. This is just one example of a leader basically saying that it's the responsibility of all true believers to finish the work of Hitler, namely to exterminate the Jewish people, to exterminate Israel. And while everybody, like Kawadawi, takes our attention and focuses on the Jew and focuses it on Israel, the Middle East is imploding with a genocide. Refugees are flooding into Lebanon, into Jordan, shaking the very stability of these two important countries. And going into Turkey, and from Turkey, they're going into Europe. And ladies and gentlemen, when we don't speak out against anti-Semitism, what's happening in the Middle East is tragically predictable. And I submit to you that we have to speak out against this fascist movement, whether it's fascist nationalism that is rising in the United Kingdom, white supremacy in the United Kingdom, in France, in Greece, in Hungary, but also the fascism of the Middle East, the fascism of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Nazism of the Muslim Brotherhood, and our silence by liberal people who care about democratic principles against this anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel, however imperfect it is, and it's not a perfect society. But to advocate the extermination of an entire group, while liberal intellectuals, while students, while the media of record remains silent, ladies and gentlemen, this is an unfolding catastrophe. In this age of internet, of social media, of instantaneous communication, our silence of the human rights community and the liberal Democrats in the West to this, what's happening in Iran, in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, is giving rise to xenophobia. Mr. Trump, when he calls countries and peoples shit or whatever the hell he said, when he wants to put up walls, when he demonizes people, and he's giving a dog whistle to the nationalists in Europe, we are faced with a very complicated, fast-moving, changing reality. And I think at the end of the day, not only does anti-Semitism and the lessons of the Holocaust, not only are they meaningful for our generation and for all of us, regardless of our background, but because of this, we have to come together as students of all backgrounds, but students who are privileged to be in an institution where education is open and free. This movement doesn't want girls to read. right? So I think if we believe in democracy and human rights, we need to come together and fight fascism and Nazism and racism and sexism and homophobia and also anti-Semitism together. And the one lesson of my people, my family, and what we're going to learn today is this. Yes, anti-Semitism is not good for the Jews. It's been killing us for a long time. But we also know once this form of hatred is unleashed on society, once it's allowed to start affecting the Jews, it's not very long at all when it starts to affect all of us. And we need to come together and stop hatred in all of its forms from as many strong voices as possible. And I urge you, you're going to be sitting here for the week of these lectures, please think about it. Please speak to your friends and colleagues from your community, from other communities, from your classes, and start to be aware. Several days ago, more than 100 people that we know of were killed by chemicals. Assad dropped chemicals on his people. The dehumanizers of the Jews and of Israel are killing their own people. But they want you to focus on the ugly image of Israel. We have to be wiser and smarter than that. We have to get over our superficial understandings and bring goodness and justice to the world. Thank you.
Anybody has a question? Just put up your hand and I'll come.
So the question is, when we think about World War II, Rwanda, Cambodia, and all those genocides, we would like to tell ourselves that if we were there, we would have done something. It would be stupid not to. But all these things are happening right now. Syria, the Middle East, Myanmar, even Trump's presidency is itself like an intellectual genocide. What is something that we can do as people from, I don't like to say first world, but like North American privileged people? I know we have social media. It is a huge tool, but I feel like if I were to write something, it would just be drowned in that. Does it still matter, or is there something more powerful that I can do?
So that's a great question, and questions are very important. Good questions are very important. I don't have an easy answer. I think what I'm doing, I don't know how effective it is. I'm going around, literally around the world, speaking to groups like you, trying to raise awareness. So the first thing we can do, I think education is power. And I would urge you, in a study group or with a teacher, read the philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood. Because in the debate, when it comes to the Middle East, to Israelis, to Palestinians, to Syria, to Egypt, the debate shifts very quickly from your important question. It's somehow the paradigms of discourse shifts it to Israel, Palestine, occupation, da-da-da-da-da. And the whole conversation goes there before we even know it. But your question, and what I'm trying to get at today too, is that there's this reality on the ground. And I think we have to stop this diversion and really focus on the problem. There is a reactionary social movement that's been inspired by Nazism and fascism in the name of whatever. They've hijacked Islam, or a reading of Islam, and they're horrifically, genocidally anti-Semitic. But tragically, the greatest victims of this movement are Muslims. And tragically, it's the socialism of fools. Everybody's looking to the Jews and to Israel, but their communities are being destroyed. Their mosques are being taken over. Their families are being broken apart. Their shopping centers are obliterated. Their community has been turned into refugees and worse. That's the reality. I just met a young gentleman from Syria His father and mother were doctors in Aleppo. Their entire family was bombed by the Russian army, military, air force, with the help of the Iranians. He's the only member of his family of 15 people to survive. He woke up in a hospital in Turkey. He was unconscious for months in a coma. And now he's in the United States. And these stories are becoming horrifically commonplace. 700,000 murdered people. So what do? I think we have to educate ourselves, read about the founding guidelines, the philosophers of the Muslim Brotherhood, who they are, what they stand for. We have to also realize that in the West, just because we treat somebody good or treat them bad, they're not going to react in the way that we think. Some liberals think if we treat them well, they're going to be good to us. Treat them bad, they're going to be bad to us. No. People have some beliefs that they're not willing to give up or they can't be bought. I have beliefs. People tons of money, I won't change my beliefs. There's some things I just won't change. And I suspect everybody in this room has something some core values that can't be bought. So we have to understand the mind of the enemy. It's well thought out. It's a philosophy that's deep and rich. It's a theology that's deep and rich. They have political and military strategies that they've been developing for 90 to 100 years. They're very smart. They're very sophisticated. They speak our languages. They know European languages. They know European and North American history inside out. We don't speak Arabic. We don't understand the culture. We don't understand the cleavages. We're ignorant, so we have to educate ourselves. That's number one. And I think number two, your question is, there's a genocide happening in Syria. Let's organize. Organize students to come together and brainstorm. Send medicine, send clothes, raise awareness. Raise awareness that the Iranian revolutionary regime that took money from the P5+1 over this liberal nuclear weapons agreement with Iran. Remember, those of us who spoke out against the nuclear weapons agreement said if you deal with Iran and bring them into the family of nations, it's going to be a catastrophe. But we were labeled as Zionists and reactionary. Now the money that the Obama administration sent, airplane full of cash, is being used to pay death squads in Syria. It's a fact. So I think that we have to fight this fascism wherever it is, from Charlottesville to Tehran to Aleppo. And I think students of goodwill, students who care about being a citizen in a democratic country, we can set an example. And I think it's really up to you. I really think it's up to your generation. I gave a talk in a synagogue the other night. It was a great honor. It's a very nice synagogue in Westmount. Big honor. I think I may have been the second youngest person in the room. The room was packed. The average age, unfortunately, we were of a generation that grew up in the shadow or grew up in the Holocaust. They know. The young people are somehow, in the Jewish community, are not there. They're disconnected for reasons, all sorts of reasons. Young people have to engage these issues, grapple, argue with each other, debate each other, but work together to raise awareness. There's a lot that can be done. And even gestures coming from Montreal may inspire other gestures from other parts of the world.
There was another question somewhere.
I'm just not sure I understood what you meant by once this form of hatred is unleashed, it's not long until it spreads out to us.
Exactly, okay. So that's a good question, thank you. So the basic point was when the Nazis and the fascists were rising in Europe, they were very anti-Semitic. And a lot of people, industrialists in North America and many parts of Europe, some liberals, some conservatives, they were kind of flirting with anti-Semitism themselves, and it wasn't reason enough to do anything to stop the fascists and to stop Hitler. There was all kinds of agreements and pacts. They kept pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off. Exactly how we're pushing off dealing with Iran and pushing off dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood. pushing up, because it costs a lot to defeat a totalitarian movement, a movement that has a culture of death. Not easy, ideologically, politically, and even militarily. So people thought, Hitler has this strange fascination with the Jews, and the Jews, you know what we think about the Jews at our dinner table, so okay. So they allowed anti-Semitism to flourish. There were laws, racial laws that were passed that Jews weren't allowed to run business, they had to leave certain areas, they had to go to ghettos. Universities, professors fired their Jewish colleagues voluntarily, but things went on as normal. But once you allow the fascists to be anti-Semitic and do away with the Jews or subjugate the Jews, then it was the socialists, then it was the gay people, then it was the Slavs, then it was the Italians, then it was the Russians. It's just this culture of hate and this culture of death. Once you allow anti-Semitism to flourish against Jews, it spreads to other people. And that's the lesson. If you look at the history of anti-Semitism, it's invariable. And today, it's exactly what's happening in the Middle East. For 2-3 generations, people were demonizing Israel, demonizing the Zionist entity. Every horrific adjective that you can talk about Jews or Israel as a cancer, as causing all the problems of the world. Originating from apes and pigs, emanating from donkey urine. Right? The cause of disease, the cause of corruption, moral corruption, physical corruption, it's the Zionist Jew. And we have tolerated that from the Middle East, and we tolerate it in our classes about the Middle East in fine institutions like McGill and like Vanier and Yale. That's sort of the discourse now, thanks to Edward Said and other postmodern thinkers, Michel Foucault. So Michel Foucault and Edward Said spent time in France in the 1970s with the exiled leadership of the Iranians. And they thought the Iranian Revolution was going to be what the French Revolution was to Enlightenment in Europe. The Iranian Revolution was going to be to Islam in the Middle East. They supported this regime and this revolution. And they said nothing about their anti-Semitism, nothing about their hatred of Zionism. They participated and furthered the hatred of Jews and Israel in Western discourse and in Western books. They poisoned the minds of a generation. And that's why I would argue that our education, thanks to Said and Foucault and a lot of money coming from the Gulf, is so twisted that our leaders don't understand that we have to fight anti-Semitism where it is and fascism where it is, otherwise we pay the price. So today, to answer your question, the Israelis are protected by a very strong army. Iran is now at the border. Iran, in the last few years, has taken over Iraq, is taking over Syria, has taken over Lebanon. It's the Shiite Crescent. And they're on the border of Israel. Their objective is to exterminate the Jews and the Israelis. And we, the intellectuals and the human rights activists, have been so confused about the anti-Zionism and Israel's an apartheid state. I was in South Africa, I lived in townships, I was shot at by the white supremacist regime as a young anti-apartheid activist. I know what apartheid is. Israel has problems and contradictions, but apartheid? Colonialism? Jews don't try to convert people. Jews don't try to change their language and culture. Never have, never did. That's colonialism. So the demonization of Israel, the focus on Israel, has enabled the fascists to gain more and more control in Syria, in Turkey, in Libya, in northern Nigeria. Girls being kidnapped and forced to go into marriage, not allowed to learn to read, is a Western colonial Jewish conspiracy against Islam. The young girls in these places should not read to remain a pure Muslim. This type of fascism has to be eradicated. And that's the lesson of anti-Semitism, and that's the lesson of how it's appropriate to understand anti-Semitism as it relates to these issues today. Because we started with the Jews and the Israelis, And I would argue, and my colleagues from Syria, my colleagues from Turkey, who I work with, intellectuals, will argue the greatest victims of anti-Semitism, of Jew hatred today, are Muslims. Think about it. Because we've allowed this ideology and the social movement to gain traction. Tragic. I think that's it. So thank you very much. And the commemoration, Marlene will direct you if you want to go to this commemoration at noon. Thank you.
Anybody